The night didn't scream danger. That's what makes it terrifying. No alarms, no neighbors calling 911, no frantic struggle caught on a camera. Just a quiet Arizona street, the kind where nothing ever happens until it does. So, let me ask you something right away. How does an 84-year-old woman vanish from her own home in the middle of the night and leave blood behind? That's the question investigators were forced to confront when a missing person call turned into something much darker. A mother gone, a home disturbed, and a discovery outside the house that changed everything. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because when investigators arrived, they didn't just find an empty residence. They found blood. Not enough to immediately explain what happened, not enough to tell a full story, but enough to raise a chilling possibility. This wasn't someone simply wandering off. This was something violent, something intentional. And here's where the story twists, because in cases like this, police usually look outward first. Strangers, intruders, random acts. The unknown, that's the narrative that feels safer, doesn't it? But this case refused to cooperate. As the hours passed, questions piled up faster than answers. No forced entry, no obvious signs of a struggle inside the home, no clear trail leading away from the property, just silence, and a stain investigators couldn't ignore. And then came the decision that would quietly turn this investigation upside down. They tested the blood. Now, most people think DNA is instant, like in TV shows. Swab, computer beep, case solved. Reality doesn't work that way. DNA takes time, and waiting is where fear lives. While the lab worked, the family waited. The public waited, and behind closed doors, investigators began preparing for outcomes no one wanted to consider. Because DNA doesn't just identify strangers, it identifies everyone. Every relative, every shared bloodline, every connection you wish didn't matter. So here's the uncomfortable question no one wanted to ask out loud. Yet, what if the danger didn't come from outside the home? What if it was already inside the family circle? That idea alone is enough to fracture trust, to poison relationships, to turn grief into suspicion. And in this case, it did exactly that. As days passed, the missing woman remained gone. No confirmed sightings, no credible tips. Just speculation, fear, and a growing media presence circling the story like vultures waiting for something to break. And then the lab called back. The DNA results were in. At first, investigators reportedly thought there had been a mistake, a contamination, a clerical error, because the name tied to the genetic profile didn't fit the narrative they'd been building. It didn't point to a drifter. It didn't point to a burglar. It didn't point to some faceless threat in the dark. It pointed inward, toward someone who should never have been on the list. Someone trusted. Someone close. Someone whose connection to the missing woman made the implications almost unbearable. And this is where everything changes. Because once investigators cross that line, there's no going back, no one thinking it, no pretending the family is just a group of victims anymore. From that moment on, every interaction is re-examined, every statement replayed, every alibi pulled apart thread by thread. And the most chilling part, the person the DNA allegedly matched was not just connected by blood or marriage. They were someone no one expected to see in handcuffs. Someone whose arrest would shock the public, fracture a family, and raise one question that still hangs over this case like a storm cloud. If the DNA tells one story, what else has been hidden all along? The call came in just after sunrise? Not a scream, not a panic, just a worried voice saying something felt wrong. An elderly woman hadn't answered her phone. The lights in her house were still on. Her morning routine, rigid, predictable, followed for years, had been broken. And when police arrived, the house greeted them with the most unsettling thing a crime scene can offer: normalcy. Furniture untouched, no shattered glass, no door kicked in, no chaos. Just a quiet home that looked almost respectful of the life that had been lived inside it. Almost, because outside the house, just beyond the threshold where safety ends, investigators spotted something that didn't belong there. Blood. Not pooled, not splattered, but unmistakable. Fresh enough to raise concern. Old enough to resist easy answers. And right away, the tone of the investigation shifted, because blood outside a home tells a very different story than blood inside one. It suggests movement. A transition, something that happened between safety and exposure, between inside and out. So investigators slowed everything down. They photographed the area, measured the stains, documented the pattern. Blood doesn't just show injury, it shows direction, pressure, intent, and the early signs didn't point to an accident. Here's the part most people don't realize. It takes surprisingly little blood to suggest serious harm. Even a few drops can signal trauma. But the absence of large quantities doesn't mean someone wasn't hurt. Neighbors were questioned. Most heard nothing. No shouts, no late-night disturbances, no vehicles racing away. A quiet street had remained quiet, and that strangely made everything worse, because crimes that happen without witnesses are rarely random. Inside the house, investigators noted subtle details: shoes still by the door, personal items left behind, no packed bags, no signs of someone preparing to leave voluntarily. This wasn't someone going for a walk. This was someone disappearing. And while police publicly described the situation as a missing person case, behind the scenes they were already treating it as something far more serious. Blood demands answers. So the decision was made to collect a sample and send it to the lab. And that decision would quietly reroute the entire investigations. The family waited. And waiting is brutal. Every hour stretches, every phone call sends a jolt of hope followed by disappointment. Publicly, investigators kept their language cautious. They spoke of concern, of ongoing searches. Privately, the questions were sharper. Who was the last person to see her alive? Who had access to the home? Who knew her routines? Who benefited from her absence? And most importantly, who wasn't acting like someone in shock? Because investigators watch behavior as closely as evidence. They notice who talks too much, who appears oddly calm. Grief doesn't follow a script, but patterns still emerge. Then there's the timing. If it happened with precision, no noise, no witnesses, no obvious struggle, that doesn't describe an amateur. That describes someone confident, someone who knew the environment, someone who knew when and how to act. And that's where the investigation quietly turned inward, because strangers don't usually know the exact moment a house will be silent. They don't know routines. They don't know vulnerabilities. But family does, friends do, trusted people do. As the days passed, the blood evidence became the anchor point of the case. Everything else felt speculative, but the blood? That was real, tangible, unarguable. And then came the waiting game for the DNA. Labs don't rush these things. Accuracy matters more than speed. And while technicians worked, investigators began preparing for outcomes they hoped wouldn't materialize. Because there are only so many ways DNA can come back. It can belong to the victim. It can belong to an unknown suspect. Or it can belong to someone already known to the family. And if it was the third option, the case would never be the same again. When the lab finally called, the tone on the other end of the line wasn't celebratory. It was cautious, measured, almost stunned, because the DNA didn't introduce a new suspect into the investigation. It narrowed the circle. And once that circle tightens, every smile, every phone call, every statement gets reinterpreted through a darker lens. Investigators didn't move immediately. They double-checked requested confirmation, ran secondary comparisons, because once you accuse someone close, you better be right. And when the confirmation came back, there was no undoing it. The blood outside the home wasn't just evidence of violence. It was a fingerprint pointing towards someone no one wanted to question. The moment investigators realized the DNA didn't belong to a stranger, the room went quiet. Not dramatic silence, professional silence. The kind that comes when trained people understand they've crossed into territory where every step can destroy lives. Because when evidence points inward, you don't just solve a case, you detonate one. Here's what most people don't understand about DNA matches. They don't arrive with emotions attached. They don't explain motives. They don't care about reputations, family roles, or public images. They simply say one thing over and over without hesitation. This blood came from here. At first, investigators didn't act. They reviewed the chain of custody, reran the analysis, confirmed there was no contamination, no lab error, no mix-up. Because accusing someone close to the victim is the fastest way to collapse an investigation if you're wrong. But the result didn't change. The genetic profile matched someone already known to the family. Someone who had access. Someone who didn't need to force entry. Someone who could move through the home without raising suspicion. And suddenly, every assumption made in the early days felt dangerously naive. Investigators pulled phone records, timeline data, security footage from nearby streets. Not because they were building a case yet, but because they needed to understand one thing first. Opportunity. Did this person have it? And the answer, quietly and devastatingly, appeared to be yes. Here's the contradiction that rocked the investigation. The person connected to the DNA hadn't acted like someone hiding something. No panic, no disappearance, no sudden change in routine. They spoke to investigators calmly, offered help, asked the right questions, almost too right. And that's where suspicion deepened, because in high-stakes cases, over-control can be just as revealing as chaos. People who rehearse their innocence often forget that real grief is messy, emotional, inconsistent. Investigators began re-listening to interviews, watching body language, studying pauses, looking for moments where the mask slipped, and then there was the timing. The blood had been found outside the home, but not near the street, not where a stranger might flee. It was closer, more personal, as if whatever happened occurred during a moment of familiarity, not intrusion. So investigators asked themselves a dangerous question. What if this wasn't a botched kidnapping? What if it was something that went wrong? An argument, a confrontation, a moment that escalated faster than anyone intended. Because statistically, crimes involving elderly victims are most often committed by people they know. That's not speculation, that's data. And once investigators accept that reality, they stop looking for monsters in the shadows. They look for them in daylight. As the pressure increased, investigators had to make a call. They couldn't sit on the DNA forever. Evidence loses power when time passes, and if the person connected to the blood realized what the police were seeing, that delay could be dangerous. So they brought them back in, not aggressively, not accusatory, just another conversation. But this time, the questions were different. More specific, more narrow, less forgiving, and something changed. Maybe it was a hesitation. Maybe it was a contradiction. Maybe it was a detail that didn't line up with the physical evidence anymore. Whatever it was, investigators noticed, because at some point, stories stop being about words and start being about what the evidence refuses to let go. The decision to move forward wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no cuffs yet. Just paperwork, calls, quiet approvals, because arrests in cases like this aren't made in the heat of the moment. They're made when silence becomes heavier than doubt. And when the order finally came down, there was no celebration, just grim acknowledgement. Because an arrest doesn't mean answers, it doesn't mean closure, and it doesn't mean the missing woman has been found. It simply means the investigation has crossed the point of no return. When authorities moved in, the shock wasn't just public, it was internal. A family that had been united by fear was now fractured by suspicion. Allies became liabilities. Grief became guarded. And the question no one could escape anymore was the same one echoing through the investigation files. If the DNA placed this person at the scene, what actually happened that night? Because an arrest solves nothing if the victim is still missing. And the most disturbing truth of all? The DNA may have identified who was there, but it still hadn't explained where she was. And that unanswered question would soon become the most dangerous part of the entire case. Here's the part of the story no one prepares you for. An arrest doesn't feel like justice when the person you're searching for is still gone. It feels hollow. When the handcuffs closed, there was no relief, no collective exhale, no sense that the nightmare had ended. Instead, the room filled with a heavier question, one that pressed down harder than all the speculation before it. Where is she? Because arrests are supposed to bring answers. They're supposed to give families something solid to hold on to. But in cases like this, an arrest can actually deepen the void. Investigators now had a name tied to the blood, a face, a presence at the scene. But presence is not explanation. An explanation is what everyone needed. The narrative the public had clung to, an unknown predator, a random act, a faceless villain, collapsed overnight. In its place stood something far more unsettling, the possibility that the danger came from within the circle of trust. That shift changes everything. Because when a case turns inward, it stops being about what happened and starts being about why. Motive becomes more important than method. History becomes evidence. Relationships are no longer background noise. They are the crime scene. Investigators began reconstructing the days before the disappearance. Conversations once considered ordinary were now examined under a microscope. Minor disagreements took on new weight, financial records, medical concerns, long-standing tensions. Nothing was off limits anymore. And the family? They were trapped between two unbearable realities. If the evidence was right, someone they trusted had answers they weren't giving. If the evidence was wrong, an innocent life was being destroyed while the real truth slipped further away. Either way, there was no clean ending. Here's the cruel irony of DNA. It feels definitive, but it rarely tells the whole story. It can place someone at a location, but it cannot tell you what they were feeling. It can confirm contact, but not intent. It can point a finger, but it can't explain what happened next. And what happened next is the question that still haunts this case. Did something go wrong in a moment of panic? Was there an argument that spiraled out of control? Was the original plan never meant to end this way? Or is there a truth so carefully buried that even DNA hasn't fully uncovered it yet? As the investigation moved forward, one reality became unavoidable. The disappearance was no longer the only tragedy. Trust had been shattered. A family had been divided in a way that could never be repaired, and the public image surrounding the case was permanently altered. But none of that brought the missing woman home. And that's the detail that matters most. Because every theory, every accusation, every headline fades into irrelevance when measured against one simple fact. An elderly woman vanished, and she has not been found. Until that changes, the story is unfinished. So we circle back to the question we started with: what if the DNA that cracked the case didn't lead to closure, but to a deeper mystery? What if it answered the wrong question first? Sometimes it opens the door to something far darker. Something that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that not all dangers come from strangers, and not all families are as safe as they appear. And until the missing woman is found, one thing remains painfully clear: the blood told investigators who was there. But it still hasn't told us what really happened.